What's up, my Canadian cousins? It's very good to see you guys again. Once again, I have a video that I'm going to be reacting to that is a suggestion from you wonderful people. It is a reaction about the Avro Arrow, which I understand, and I did a little looking up beforehand, that this was a state-of-the-art interceptor plane that was built to intercept mostly Soviet long-range bombers and to protect North American airspace, and hopefully, if it had been successful, to have sold it to allies in Europe as well. So I'm not by any means an expert in military aviation, and I don't know necessarily what an interceptor is, other than that the word implies the meaning. But I did look it up, and I do understand that this is not a fighter jet. This was ahead of its time. You know, I think that this is sort of interesting and maybe a little bit timely, since North American airspace has clearly been violated recently with the Chinese air balloon. And so I've been thinking a lot about it, and I'm going to be doing a video that, as a companion to this video, about NORAD and what NORAD actually is doing in present day. I hope to be able to link it to this video so that they get posted at the same time. I'm just not sure I'll have time, but if I don't, it certainly will come out very close in time to this one. So in any event, let's get to look about the Avro Arrow, and I will see you, my friends, on the flip side.
World War, Canada developed a leading aerospace industry under the leadership of Avro Canada. The company collected some of the brightest minds in aerospace and worked on some projects that even today still seem fantastic. Some even argue that Canada was on a trajectory to place a man on the moon. And then came Black Friday. The demise of the Avro Canada CF-105 Arrow changed the trajectory of Canadian aerospace and the world's aerospace technology, and still leaves to this day Canadians wondering what might have been. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Many factors came together to build the robust Canadian aerospace industry that produced the Avro Arrow. Although there was aircraft manufacturing in Canada during the Great War, notably a plant in Toronto producing the famous JN-4 Jenny for the Curtiss Corporation, the origins of Avro Canada are really derived from the Second World War, and start with a company more known for railroad rolling stock than wings. National Steel Car was established in 1912 with an initial factory in Hamilton, Ontario, to build railroad rolling stock. The factory hit production just in time to serve a railroad boom in Canada, and orders and investment return exceeded all expectations. New investors purchased the company and incorporated it in 1919 as National Steel Car Corporation Limited. The company did well until the Depression, when it had to start diversifying operations to stay open. As early as 1935, the British government saw war clouds on the horizon. Among the many preparations was an effort to be able to ramp up aircraft production called the Shadow Scheme. The idea was to bring aviation expertise to automobile manufacturing, both to be able to rapidly increase production in the event of war, and to disperse production to make it less vulnerable in case factories were bombed. The British government contracted with automobile companies to create shadow plants that would shadow their normal automotive operations, but where expertise would be transferred, such that the plants could turn quickly from automobile to aircraft production. The government...
Sure, I mean, it was done a lot here in the United States too. Ford, General Motors, all of them started building aircraft, tanks, you name it, and they put the expertise of mass production and assembly line together with the engineering to create the weapons of war. I don't think that we'd be capable of doing that anymore, because we just don't have that kind of manufacturing economy.
Funded the construction of the additional factories with loans and grants. Similar programs were started in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. This not only increased the production potential, but by dispersing production throughout the empire, that made the production less vulnerable to attack. As part of the scheme, National Steel Car started receiving contracts for aircraft production. The company subcontracted parts for a number of aircraft, including the Hawker Hurricane, the Avro Anson, and the Handley Page Hampden. In 1938, they built a manufacturing plant for their new aircraft division in Malton, Ontario, building the Westland Lysander, a rugged liaison aircraft. After Britain entered the war in 1939, production was to increase. The Malton plant was initially planned to manufacture the B-26 Marauder twin-engine bomber designed by the American Glenell Martin Company. But in 1941, the company instead received a contract to build the Avro Lancaster 10 heavy bomber. The Avro Lancaster was a
I know about the Lancaster bomber. I didn't know that was built by a Canadian
heavy bomber, requiring complex manufacturing that included more than 500,000 manufacturing operations to construct a plane. The sheer complexity of the design resulted in concerns about National Steel Car's ability to manage such projects. The Malton plant was, therefore, expropriated by the government and set up as a government-owned crown corporation called Victory Aircraft. National Steel Car continued to contribute to the war effort, producing shells, gun parts, and Army truck bodies. It had been founded in 1910 by Elliott Verdon Rowe, an early aircraft pioneer. The company was incorporated under his name as the A.V. Rowe Aircraft Company, which was later renamed simply Avro Aircraft. The company built a number of planes, notably the Avro 504, one of the most produced biplane aircraft of the First World War. In 1935, the company was acquired by Hawker Siddeley, but continued to manufacture under the Avro name. Avro built a number of important aircraft for the Second World War, but none more important than the Avro Lancaster, which became the principal heavy bomber used by the Royal Air Force, the Royal Canadian Air Force, and Commonwealth forces. Victory Aircraft built the Lancaster Mark 10, which differed from the other models in that it used American-made instruments and electrics, and the Merlin engines were built under license by the U.S. Packard Company.
Okay, so Merlin engines by license from Packard Company. That's interesting because I do know that Merlin engines are Rolls-Royce designed, and I believe that they sold or licensed the designs to Packard to build the engines in the United States for our bombers. And so it seems like it's almost coming full circle from a British car company that's designing these, superb engines that then get built by Packard in the United States to go into Canada. And I'm saying it's full circle because, correct me if I'm wrong, I think what I'm hearing is that Avro was a British/Canadian company. It seems like there was a Canadian division of this company that was also British. Am I wrong about that? I'm not really sure. I could be confused.
Victory Aircraft built 430 of the more than
That wouldn't surprise me that I get confused.
7,000 Lancaster bombers that were eventually produced. In addition, Victory manufactured 3,197 Avro Ansons, which were mostly used as multi-crew trainer aircraft. Towards the end of the Second World War, there was discussion in the Canadian government about the importance of maintaining an indigenous Canadian aerospace industry, but in 1945, the government negotiated the sale of Victory Aircraft to Hawker Siddeley. Hawker Siddeley then made the new Canadian facility the Canadian branch of their UK-based subsidiary, A.V. Rowe & Company, naming the new entity A.V. Rowe Canada Limited. The Malton facility largely served and repaired World War II era aircraft that were still in service, including the Hawker Sea Fury in the North.
I guess what he said a few moments ago sort of answers my question. It's still a little bit confusing about the hierarchy of the or the organization of this company.
But the company also invested in research and development, looking to be on the cutting edge of the jet age, designing a jet engine, jet fighter aircraft, and jet passenger aircraft. One of the first projects was the design of Canada's first jet fighter aircraft, the Avro Canada CF-100 Canuck. The Canuck, the only Canadian-designed fighter aircraft to ever reach normal production, was an interesting aircraft, but its largest impacts on the Canadian aerospace industry were not in the plane itself. The Canuck ran into serious production delays, including the crash of one of the prototypes, killing the pilot. As a result, resources were shifted away from the Avro Canada C-102. The C-102 prototype first flew August 10, 1949, making it only the second passenger jet airliner in the world. In fact, were it not for runway repairs at the Malton Airport, the C-102 might have beaten the de Havilland Comet into the air. In April 1950, the jetliner carried the world's first jet airmail from Toronto to New York City in just 58 minutes, half the previous record. The crew was welcomed with a ticker-tape parade through the streets of Manhattan. The C-102
I've flown from New York City to Toronto, and that's probably about how long it takes to do that flight today.
Had a buyer in Howard Hughes at Trans World Airlines, but Avro lacked the manufacturing space and bandwidth and was focused on the CF-100. The cancellation of the C-102 stopped the nascent Canadian commercial airliner industry in its tracks. Secondly, the CF-100 production delays led to a deal between the Canadian government and Avro Canada to bring Crawford Gordon Jr., who had been instrumental in organizing industrial resources during the war, over from the Department of Defense to become Avro Canada's general manager in 1951. Under Gordon, Avro Canada diversified and acquired numerous companies, quickly growing until, in 1956, it became Canada's third largest corporation, employing over 50,000 employees in 44 companies representing multiple industries. And the company, with growing confidence and expertise in aerospace, undertook its most ambitious project yet. Even though the CF-100 was not yet in full production, Avro was already working on a much more advanced replacement, the Avro CF-105 Arrow. The development of the CF-105 was a realization that the Soviet Union was already working on jet bomber aircraft that would make the CF-100 obsolete.
Now, I know that this was in the 1950s, but to me that looks a little bit like the French Mirage with the
need
with the
was
Delta
recognized
wing
for an
design.
all-weather, supersonic jet interceptor. The Avro Arrow was the result of a series of design studies that examined improvements on the CF-100. The CF-105 addressed the issue of wave drag at supersonic speeds by using a delta wing, which allowed greater fuel and payload capacity than a swept wing.
So in preparation for this video, what I read about the concept of these interceptors, especially those that were being built and designed in the 1950s, is the need for speed. It just sounded like the Top Gun. I have the need for speed. The need for speed to intercept bombers from far away very quickly. So you need a supersonic jet that could do over Mach 2, for the time, which was, I think, the goals for these interceptors. And, they're not dogfighting planes, but they would fire missiles, or the concept was that they would fire missiles from long ranges out still to intercept and destroy the bombers before they got a chance to do any damage.
Design and more powerful engines would have allowed a supersonic aircraft with a potential max speed of Mach 2, with the ability to be armed with air-to-air missiles, a substantial improvement over the CF-100. The plane was one of the most advanced design concepts in the world and incorporated a number of innovations, including one of the first stability augmentation systems. An aggressive production schedule was required to counter the development of Soviet jet bombers, and Avro decided to take a risk on production model, where the assembly line was produced before the prototypes, and adjusted as testing refined the process. This meant that the plane could move from testing to production much more quickly, but had a greater front-end capital risk. The plane was first rolled out October 4th, 1957, and after initial testing, was impressive. The prototypes displayed excellent handling and achieved a Mach 1.
I guess this is a concept drawing, but boy, is that beautiful looking. Just forgetting about all the engineering and what it can do. It's just a beautiful
1.90 in steady level flight. In 1981, aviation author and expert Bill Gunston described the Avro Arrow as, in almost every way, the most advanced of all the fighters of the 1950s. That was as impressive and successful as any aircraft in history. And on February 20th, 1959, with only 5 prototypes for the Avro Arrow produced, the government of Canada officially canceled the program. There are many explanations for the demise of the Avro Arrow. If the date of the rollout, October 4th, 1957, sounded familiar, that's because that was also the day that the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial Earth satellite.
Sputnik.
Not only did the launch steal the thunder from the CF-105's rollout, it represented a tectonic shift in strategic thinking. The fear now was ballistic missiles, not bomber aircraft. And even so much as bomber aircraft were concerned, the answer seemed to be ground-to-air missiles rather than high-speed interceptors. To be fair, the Arrow program was expensive, competing with other priorities. Both the Army and the Navy opposed the programs that shifted so much resources to the Air Force. In parliamentary elections in June of 1957, the Progressive Conservative Party, led by John Diefenbacher, won more seats than the Liberal government of Louis Saint Laurent. Diefenbacher was a conservative who had run against rampant liberal spending and was not supportive of the program. In August 1957, Canada officially signed the North American Air Defense Agreement, or NORAD agreement, and the U.S. made this.
Yeah, and so that's what the companion video is about, the NORAD, the joint NORAD agreement between Canada and the United States to protect our airspace. But, that video looks at it from a modern perspective, but this is more historical. And that's interesting because it seems like this is impacting the, I guess in the Canadian government's view at the time, the cost benefit of an interceptor aircraft when it looked like the future was going to be intercontinental ballistic missiles and developing ground-based surface-to-air missiles to possibly destroy whatever was coming, and it was extraordinarily expensive. And I wonder what Canada's GDP was at the time, so that, and population too. I'm sorry if I get this wrong, my friends, but I think your population right now is something like 30 million. And, we're over 300 million. And of course, back in the 1950s, we weren't close to that number. We were still several hundreds of millions. I'm not sure what exactly. And I know that, Canada's population was lower than it is now. So it must have been a very big budgetary decision to make as to whether or not Canada could afford to move into the aerospace defense field when there were competing priorities.
Semi-automatic ground environment, or SAGE, available to Canada, along with the Beaumark ground-to-air missile. The government determined that it could not afford both SAGE Beaumark and the Arrow, and the Arrow had failed to garner an international sale to help defray cost. When the government announced the cancellation, they said it was a result of a careful analysis of threats. Whatever the combination of politics, changes in strategic threats, and development costs, the cancellation was devastating to Avro Canada. The general consensus was that the leadership was completely unprepared, and the day of the cancellation has been called the Black Friday for Canadian aviation. The aeronautics branch had put all its efforts into the program, and the process of building the assembly line first meant all its capital was committed. Hawker Siddeley closed Avro Aircraft, and immediately the 15,000 people working at the Malton plant lost their jobs, and that number again lost their jobs in the supply chain. The company tried to reassign the engineers from the project to other parts of the company, but aeronautical engineers didn't want to design cars. Many left the country.
Oh, that's such a shame. Because the talent that was there in order to build this, state-of-the-art, ahead of its time aircraft, albeit obsolete before it really got to get going, okay, times were changing rapidly, but maybe chalk that up to look at the invaluable experience that they gained in building this aircraft and could have translated that into other types of aircraft that would have been needed. I know that, something that came shortly after this from American military perspective was the F-4 Phantom, which started service in the 1960s, but it was designed in the 1950s and had similar capabilities, I think, in terms of speed, Mach, over Mach 2.5, maybe approaching Mach 3, but was a fighter jet. We used it extensively in Vietnam. But, I can envision taking the experience of the Avro Arrow and turning it into something like the F4 of the time. And all those talented people lost their jobs, and yeah, of course, someone who can design and build this thing is not going to be happy working on automotive
for the U.S. or the United Kingdom. The company tried to reassign the engineers from the project to other parts of the company, but aeronautical engineers didn't want to design cars. Many left the country for the U.S. or the United Kingdom, causing a dispersal and massive brain drain of the Canadian aerospace expertise. The other assets of the once massive company were slowly divested. The Avro Arrow was not just canceled, it was eradicated. Within 2 months of canceling the program, the prototypes, all the tooling and design specifics were ordered to be destroyed because of security concerns. Only the nose of one of the prototypes was preserved, although there had been persistent rumors that one of the 5 prototypes was hidden away. And there had been scale models and reproductions that had been produced and displayed. In addition to the Arrow, the Avro...
Oh, that sucks. I obviously have no expertise to comment one way or another about the security capabilities of Canada at the time, but it just seems a shame that they couldn't find a way to keep at least one of these jets intact, hidden away somewhere, which now would be in
A special
a
projects
museum.
group that innovated designs. The work of the SPG continued past the demise of Avro aircraft, notably working on the Avro car flying saucer idea until 1961. If the idea of a Canadian space program seems far-fetched today, it was very real. Jim Chamberlain, chief of design for the CF-105, led a team of some 25 Avro engineers that joined NASA after the cancellation of the Arrow. Chamberlain was head of engineering for Project Mercury, chief designer and NASA's first project manager for the Gemini spacecraft, and a troubleshooter on the Apollo program. His contributions were central to the U.S. manned spaceflight program and represent the significance of the brain pool that was lost after the cancellation of the Arrow. In 2013, Rob Cohen, CEO of the Canadian Air and Space Museum, speculated to Global News that if the company had been left alone to continue the development process, Canada would have had a man on the moon.
That's incredible to think. And I have to think that, look, what drove the space programs in both the United States and Soviet Union was very much competing for prestige, but also the military application of, these rockets. So was there enough room on the world stage for another player? Maybe. Would it have made sense when Canada and the United States were on the same side of the Cold War divide? Not sure. Not sure it would have made sense for Canada to spend that kind of money on a space program. Maybe it would have made more sense if Canada had its own independent space agency to collaborate with the United States. And obviously the brain drain meant that there was collaboration, but it wasn't under the auspices of any kind of Canadian space agency. I'm a patriot, but I'm not a blind patriot. So I'm not one of these people that would have said, "Oh, I wouldn't have liked that." That's an American achievement. Obviously, it isn't just. And we've known that for a long time because I hate to say it, but Werner von Braun, we took some, and so did the Soviets, took some German rocket scientists after the war that helped develop our program. And obviously we got, very talented engineers from Canada and from all over the place. And it would have been nice for it to be a bilateral cooperative achievement for both of our countries. And I think it would have been really good for our relationship as well. But this is how it turned out.
The story of the Avro Canada CF-105 Arrow represents the challenges of the Cold War when perceived threats and rapidly shifting technologies competed with government attempts to put a cap on spiraling defense spending and other priorities. Cancellation of the Arrow has to be seen within the context of the day. The focus on high-speed interceptors shifted away, right, as what promised to be perhaps the best high-speed interceptor ever built was about to make its debut. But the aerospace industry and the history, really, of the world might have been different if Canada did not suffer the brain drain that came with the cancellation of the Avro Arrow. And so the history of the CF-105 is not just in the history of what happened, but in the lost history of what might have been. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history.
The History Guy, yes. Thank you very much. I did enjoy that quite a lot. And I like how he concluded, because it's exactly what I was thinking, the history of what might have been. And when you see where space has, the aerospace industry has developed, at least insofar as space is concerned, not necessarily defense, but it's a very cooperative thing right now. I recall as a kid, I grew up in the 80s and knowing a lot about the space shuttle, and I was watching the day that Challenger exploded because there was a school teacher on and every school kid in the country was watching on TV. I happened to be homesick with my little sister, and we were upset that we were going to miss watching this launch at school, and we watched it at home. But I'm digressing a little bit. What I was going to say is I remember when Canada developed the cargo arm for the space shuttle. We have SpaceX now as a private company that works with NASA. We have the International Space Station, so you have a lot of nations coming together to work on collaboratively on that, and it's a different time for sure. So yeah, no, this was very interesting. I just kind of I'm gonna pause this for a second and come back. I'll edit it so it'll be instantaneously for you, but I just want to see how the Arrow compared to other planes that were being developed at the time in the 1950s. Okay, so it wasn't the only interceptor plane that was being developed like that. That was actually also canceled. There was one from the United States that was canceled because of the rapidly growing change in technology and in where governments thought that they had to spend money. So that's interesting. And the thing I had just read, which actually was from a Canadian, and I like this very much, is that the Arrow is like the James Dean of fighter aircraft. It was very short-lived. Its star burned bright. It died too young, and you always wonder what could have been. So I'm going to leave you with that thought. It's not my original thought, but I liked it very much, so I thought I would repeat it here. Okay, my friends. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you soon. Take care.